How good is Mini LED? Because at the end of the day, it sounds like Apple might want to transition to OLED across everything next year anyway. Let's begin. So these reports are coming from a somewhat spotty source, Digitimes, who is not great. Most of the time they're wrong, though. It's usually in relation to timelines. So they might be thinking this transition is taking place sooner than it actually is. But in their latest report, they talked a lot about how Apple plans on switching to OLED panels in the iPad Air, the iPad Pro, and even some MacBooks after they have already transitioned from Mini LED, which definitely sounds weird, right? We've been talking about Mini LED for ages. We're more than likely going to get an iPad Pro with Mini LED later this month, and we've been hearing about 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros adopting Mini LED, which, if you don't know, basically works fairly similarly to an LCD display. It's just instead of a giant backlight in the back, you have individual dimming zones, kind of like the Pro Display XDR, just a bit more miniaturized. And the main difference here to acknowledge is that Mini LED is not flexible, and it doesn't have the same amount of burn-in issues as OLED, but the display panel itself is typically a bit thicker, which is why the 12.9-inch iPad Pro with Mini LED coming out later this month is rumored to be a slight bit thicker than even the 2018 iPad Pro, which came with a LCD panel. So even a bit thicker than that. Whereas OLED can be a lot thinner, of course. It does not need a backlight or local dimming zones of any kind because the individual pixels get bright and dark enough, and that allows you to make an even thinner display panel, which is partially why Apple started with OLED in the Apple Watch and typically results in higher resolutions because of the different arrangement of pixels, which is why you saw such a big jump in the resolution between iPhone 11 and iPhone 12 with that switch to OLED. And please do your best to not get any of this confused with micro LED, which unfortunately is different. That has even higher pixel density than OLED. It's thinner, it uses less power, and it's been in the speculative department for the past 4 years. I remember talking about micro LED way back when, saying, oh, I hope it comes out someday, and here we are, and we're like, well, I hope it comes into consumer products. Obviously, there's been a few demo units at CES and there's been prototypes, but has not found its way into a smartphone or a smartwatch or a computer screen yet. And on top of that, there's even micro OLED, which is even different from micro LED. I know, it's very confusing, but point being, Apple is weighing out their options to see what kind of OLED displays they can bring, and you may be thinking, why? My guess is part of it has to do with power consumption. If they can transition away from Mini LED, which sounds weird because they're just adopting it this year, to only 1 year later switch to OLED so that they can fit thinner display panels in their devices, even though MacBook display lids are already pretty thin as it is. Apple might want to push it further or maybe make some more room in that display lid so they can have a better webcam. That would be very much appreciated. Or perhaps fit a larger battery into the same size iPads we have of today. That could be a way that we retain the high dynamic range and those dark inky blacks and those amazing nits so you can enjoy all of your iPhone Dolby Vision video on the iPad as well. You might be able to achieve all that with less power consumption and higher pixel density if they brought OLED to the iPads as well. Then you're potentially looking at, I don't know, maybe a 3 to 4K resolution on a tablet, and most of the time no one's going to notice the difference, I know, but the main challenge Apple is probably facing right now is the extreme cost of OLED displays, which there's not a whole plethora of companies that can make enough displays to meet Apple's demand, which is partially why it took Apple so long to adopt OLED on the iPhone, and most of where Apple is getting their OLED displays from today is from Samsung, who charges quite a premium. In fact, it's been reported that the display is the single most expensive part of all these latest generation iPhones, even more than the 5G modems. So of course, if they want to adopt OLED across all these other products, it makes it a bit more expensive, which is why Apple's working directly with companies like LG and BOE and trying to find out how they can get OLED panels for cheaper. And it sounds like it just might take until next year for Apple to find supply chains good enough at making OLED panels at a cheap enough cost that can still reach their standards, because at the end of the day, I'm sure Apple wants a MacBook Extreme Dynamic Range variant. MacBook Pro XDR, you can imagine that happening already. And one little highlight from this Digitimes report that I really love to see, and of course, don't get too excited because this is Digitimes we're talking about here, but he did mention a 16 to 17-inch MacBook Pro that would potentially launch next year. As soon as I saw that 17-inch, I was like, oh my god, I already thought the 16-inch MacBook Pro was huge. Now imagine if they got the bezels even slimmer, even thinner, and it's an OLED display, so it consumes less power and has better efficiency for battery life and that kind of thing, plus all the dynamic range benefits of OLED, and it's a larger display than the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Oh man, I would love to see that so much. I would love to see the 17-inch MacBook Pro return, just with Apple Silicon inside, and hopefully what they can figure out with these OLED panels is how to avoid burn-in, because iPhones haven't had much of a burn-in issue, but it still is a problem with OLED displays in general, and the truth is, iPads and even more so MacBooks tend to have the same display showing the same pixels on for long periods of time, and that's typically why you want to steer away from having an OLED display on a laptop, because the screen can stay on at a high brightness for a long period of time, and that's how you can do damage to the display. And it took a few years for Apple to find a way to make the iPhone resist burn-in, though it does still happen. There are cases of it. It's just a lot more rare than it was with a lot of Android phones that came out before the iPhone 10 that didn't really iron out OLED. They noticed burn-in a lot quicker. So Apple doesn't want to have that situation with iPads and MacBooks, of course. So that's another hurdle they're going to have to get over. So I'm not saying to definitely expect OLED to come out by 2022 across MacBooks and iPads, but at the same time, it says something about mini LED, and I think a lot of people put it up on a pedestal of, oh, this is perfect and mini LED is the future, and all the time on Twitter and Discord, and of course YouTube comments, I see people getting micro LED and mini LED confused into thinking they're exact same thing, and they're like, when are they going to put mini LED on the iPhone? It's like, no, consumes more power, not as high pixel density, and it's thicker, so that is not the future. Micro LED, yes, but no one's found a way to mass produce that effectively yet. Though at the end of the day, I don't really blame you guys. They are very similar, and it's easy to get confused between all these different display technologies. I'm sure I've made several mistakes in the recording of this video, but if my channel was based on how accurate my reports are, I would have died a long time ago. But either way, I'm curious to know your guys' thoughts of Apple at least considering OLED after mini LED. Does that change your opinion on how great mini LED is going to be of a technology, or do you still think mini LED is going to be fine and the differences between that and OLED are going to be indiscernible? This is your Alp Sheep here. I'll see you guys in the next one.